Okay, welcome everyone. What a pleasure to see you all and to welcome also the quite large number of people online, which, as you will see, is very appropriate for this meeting where we're going to be talking about mediated digital relationships. So I have learned, having met face-to-face for the first time with Professor Loretta Baldassar last week, it feels like sort of years ago, when she first came to South Africa, that we must not disparage distance, that all sorts of things can happen virtually as well as in the same room. If you look at the program, Professor Moyo has not had a rather unfortunate makeover. I'm Leslie Swartz. Professor Moyo has just stepped off an aeroplane and rushed here. Thank you for getting here. Professor Moyo is our Deputy Vice Chancellor in charge of research, innovation, and postgraduate studies at Stellenbosch University. And I'm just giving her a chance to catch her breath, but she will be making some remarks at the end before Professor Himla Sudial, who's the Executive Officer of the Academy of Science of South Africa. My name's Leslie Swartz. I work in the Psychology Department at Stellenbosch University. I'm also the Editor-in-Chief of the South African Journal of Science. And you have me either to thank or to blame, and my colleague Maria Marchetti-Mercer, who's a professor at University of the Witwatersrand, we nominated Professor Baldassar to come and visit South Africa. She's now seen more of South Africa than I have, all in a very small space of time. It's been an absolute pleasure to meet her and to host her. This has really been a group effort. There's been the most unbelievable organization and support from the Academy of Science of South Africa. I don't know where Tebogo and there, I can't see you anymore. And under the leadership of Tebogo Mabota and her team and Professor Sudial, who is the executive officer from Stellenbosch University, Professor Moyo and her team, and it's such a pleasure to be here at STIAS. Everybody at Stellenbosch knows that it's always a pleasure and a privilege to come here, so that's why we invited you, Loretta. Thank you, Professor Kiramir, Christoph, Nelmarie, all the people here. Professor Kiramir will talk very briefly about the program. I'll tell you a little bit more after that about Professor Baldassar, then she will give her lecture. My colleague, Professor Marchetti-Mercer from the Psychology Department at Wits University and Associate Dean, Assistant Dean for their Faculty of Humanities will chair the discussions, and then we'll have some closing remarks from Professor Moyo, and finally from Professor Sudial. I'm terribly excited, but I can talk a lot when I'm excited, but I'm sure you want to get onto the main event. So over to you, Professor Kiramir. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
I didn't want to make an excuse of not arriving on time, but yeah, it's been an interesting morning. So we had this meeting, which was supposed to start at 8, and we're waiting for the minister who arrived 2 hours later, and we finished, but thank God we finished on time. I think it was the launch of the Innovation Fund today, so thank you so much. So I'm going to stand on the protocols. I think this is the safest way of what you have already done. I believe you've welcomed everyone. So I'm really just grateful that today we are here. We are all here and collaborating. So the initiative of the Department of Science and Innovation, the Academy of Science of South Africa, Stellenbosch University, and of course WITS, because it was a joint application. And then, of course, STIAS, which is always our home. We feel like we are part of STIAS, so we take it for granted, but I shouldn't take it for granted. I mean, for your kindness and for hosting us as well. And then, of course, Stellenbosch University. When I looked at the title, I was wondering, I'm so excited because I don't know what I will hear today. I tried not to attend any of the other sessions or not to even get the online links so that I feel motivated for today. So it's Transnational Family Care, from social death to digital kinning over a century of Australian migration. So this is really interesting. So my role really is to welcome all of you, and I know it's graduation week as well. I don't know if you know that. So if you're wondering why are the chairs a bit empty, we are competing with too many functions, but of course, I think there's one session now, right? If I remember, I couldn't remember if there was a session, but I think that might be the case. But otherwise, the chairs could have all been taken. But I think, are we recording the session? I hope. So then colleagues can hear that. So so really to welcome Professor Baldassar to the university, and we really look forward to hearing from you. And I know that the Distinguished Visiting Scholar Program is an initiative of the Academy of Science of South Africa, and at Stellenbosch University, we're really glad to host you as a fellow, and I should thank you, Leslie, for really pushing this and making sure that we were able to host this event. So without saying too many remarks and delaying the process, I want to just welcome you and thank you. So at the end, there's a slight change in the program, so the closing remarks will be made by the CEO. I think that's appropriate as well, because I know she's also a social scientist and a killer web. So we look forward to that as well. And so, but thank you and welcome. And then we're meeting later, I think, after the session in an informal. So thank you so much and look forward to the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much and welcome to everybody. And again, I'll follow cue and say all protocol observed. It's a pleasure to host you here, and since the program has changed slightly, that we have Himmler here, then I will not speak that much about the program itself, and she will have the opportunity to do so. My name is Edward Chirumira. I'm Professor of Medical Sociology, originally from Uganda, but Director of STIAS since 2019. It looks like a long time. Years go by. Welcome to this space. Our currency is a creative space for the mind. That's all what we give, and also what we expect to receive. That's a space where individuals come as individuals, as collective, to challenge even themselves without the competition, disciplinary competition, but also the need to cross-pollinate and come up with very good ideas. I've been already talking with a distinguished visiting scholar outside, and I'm expecting an application from her for the residencies that we give here, that give us an opportunity to exchange and grow ideas and across generations and other geographies. So welcome again, and just make one or two comments. The first is that in the wake of the STIAS ASSAf lecture that was given by Abdulrazak Guna, it got us thinking that perhaps we can partner with ASSAf in a much more longer term partnership, where we can host some of the scholars related to ASSAf's programs, including the Distinguished Visitors Scholars. So our meeting here is part of that commitment, that we can work with ASSAf to attract or to convince scholars to come. And the African continent is very contagious. Once you've come, you keep coming. But we have to get you to come to begin with. And we hope that between us, ASSAf and ourselves, and Stellenbosch University, and the universities in South Africa, we can play that role of bringing back and inviting scholars to the African continent to be in conversation with the bright minds that we have on the continent. So would like the conversation, instead of being in Geneva or Washington, D.C., to be in South Africa for not just Africa, but for the continent, for the world, and for humankind. So in that regard, we think that we'll continue to work with ASSAf and with the universities in South Africa to play that role of attracting and being convening in that particular respect. So thank you very much for operationalizing that aspect, and thank you, Leslie, for choosing that we can host I told you he's a very persuasive person, but I think he was persuasive on something that was really nice. And so thank you, Himmler, for also asking us to join you in this wonderful program, and we're looking forward to the presentation. I'm sure you won't disappoint. No pressure at all, but yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm lucky enough to introduce Professor Loretta Baldassar. She's a professor of anthropology and sociology and has a very unusual position at Edith Cowan University. She's a Vice Chancellor's Professorial Research Fellow, and she's also the director of the Social Aging Futures Lab at Edith Cowan University. She's recently in a country which focuses a lot on migration and ethnic studies. Loretta was recently named the Australian Research Field Leader in Migration Studies and Ethnic and Cultural Studies. So she's really somebody kind of special. She's lead chief investigator on a medical research future fund on dementia and migrant communities project. She's the social support stream lead on the National Frailty Kit project, which is fascinating. I've had a chance to look at that, and co-chief investigator of the Youth Mobilities Project. And her work is widely acknowledged as foundational to the field of transnational family studies. She's had a major role in actually creating the field of transnational family studies, and I've just been incredibly lucky to be able to work with my friend and colleague, Professor Maria Marchetti Mercer, who sent an email to Professor Baldassar, and we did a book together, which I'm so delighted about. She's a real innovator and a contributor to science in general, to thinking about science and technology. And I think, as you'll see, I was a little bit anxious. I'd had lots of online contact with Loretta before she came to South Africa, but it could have been a disaster, because we have spent a lot of time together, and if we hadn't liked it, it would have been rather awful. But it's been absolutely amazing, and part of that has to do with how she places herself in the world as a humble scholar, and you'll see an excellent science communicator. We're so lucky to have you, and I'm looking forward to hearing this talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction, Leslie, and for the very warm welcome. I have to say that 2 weeks ago, when I landed in Johannesburg, I wasn't sure I'd still be standing at this point, so I'm really pleased that I made it. This is my 5th university visit, and it's such an honour and a privilege to be able to be part of this adventure, touring the country. And I want to acknowledge ASSAf, and in particular your selection of a social scientist in a time in the world when STEM and science are really dominating. I really think that's a courageous choice, so thank you. Special thanks, of course, to Professor Himmler Sudiel, the Executive Officer of ASSAf, and to your marvellous team, who we've really got to know over the course of these 2 weeks, especially Teboho Mabota and Malusi Thuala. Just an extraordinary team. And thank you to Stellenbosch University for hosting us, and I'm delighted that this has facilitated a closer collaboration moving forward with ASSAf. So Professor Moyo, the DVCR of Stellenbosch, I know how busy academics are, especially senior academics like yourself, and to make the time to be here is really wonderful. Thank you. It says a lot about your university. To Professor Kirumira, I'd love your job, steering this Institute of Advanced Studies with these amazing scholars who visit throughout the year. I'm definitely putting in an application, and I'm already talking to Maria and Leslie about the kind of project that we might build coming out of these visits. I'm not only doing public lectures, I'm also doing workshops with early career researchers and higher degree research students, and that has been the most amazing experience for me, learning about what it is like being an early career and a HDR student in South Africa today. It's a very complex place, as you all know, and that's been a gift. So in the spirit of this space of creativity without competition that is nurtured by STIAS, I'm delighted to present my talk to you today. As Leslie mentioned, I have got a number of seemingly diverse projects: dementia and migrant communities, youth mobility, social frailty, and it was really difficult to choose one topic to present to you today, but I decided to talk about transnational families, which is where it all began. And part of the reason I chose that is in honour, really, of the book that Maria and Leslie and I have co-authored together. It's the first book on transnational families in Africa, and Maria has brought along a couple of copies. We launched it 2 weeks ago at WITS, and it's really going to shape the field, in particular around the notion of digital justice, and I'll come back to that theme throughout the talk. So what I'm going to do is, my talk is divided into 4 sections. The first is an introduction to the key questions and themes and theories of transnational family studies. So it doesn't matter if you've never heard about this topic before. It's a bit of a masterclass, so that's great. I hope you enjoy it. Then I'll look at the experiences, the lived experiences of transnational families in the past, in what we call the pre-polymedia or pre-internet times. Some of you here might remember those times. There was a time before the internet. Before considering more contemporary experiences of families today since the revolution in information and communication technologies. I use ethnographic data to bring those stories to life. And I'm hoping to introduce the concepts of digital kinning and digital homing, 2 ideas I hope are fun to think with, and I'm really keen to hear if you find them convincing, and I'd love to engage with you about those ideas, digital kinning in particular. And I'll conclude with some policy considerations from this work. So, to begin, I'm just going to try and drop that a bit because I'm really short. There we go. Yep. Yep. Is that okay? Can you hear me at the back? Yeah, okay. So, most of my research has focused on so-called transnational families, and let me begin by asking you to raise your hand if you're familiar with this term, if you've heard about it in the literature, if you've read something about transnational families. Okay, that's great. That's more than usual, all right? So there's about, I don't know, maybe even a quarter of you who've said yes. So by transnational families, I simply mean families whose members are separated by distance, often crossing national borders, but not always. But these are families who, despite that distance and separation, still feel that they're a part of a family. And on the slide now is the most commonly quoted definition of transnational families, families that live some or most of the time separated from each other, yet hold together and create something that can be seen as a feeling of collective welfare and unity or familyhood across national borders. So hands up now that you know the definition if you are a member of a transnational family. All right, now we get the whole audience involved, okay. And maybe your family members are not separated only by national borders, maybe in a country as big as South Africa and like the state of Western Australia and the country of Australia, maybe they're just separated by distance, and so we call those translocal families. There might not be national borders involved, but there's still a lot of distance involved. So perhaps not surprisingly, my interest in transnational families was inspired by my own family history, which spans the century of Italian-Australian migration history. My initial inspiration in particular came from the lived experiences of my great-grandmother, and she's pictured seated in this photograph. Her husband, my great-grandfather, migrated to the southwest of Western Australia, an area that looks very similar to the Western Cape, actually. He migrated to the southwest of WA in 1925, so next year that'll be 100 years ago. And he left her behind in their hometown in the mountains on the Swiss-Italian border. They practiced transhumance, where they moved up and down the mountain following the seasons, and pictured here is their summer residence at the top of the mountain. That sounds so glamorous. I assure you it was a very humble dwelling, and it still stands pictured here. So he left her with 2 kids and 1 on the way. So little Auntie Mary, with her underpants showing under her skirts, wasn't yet born. So great-grandmother was pregnant with Auntie Mary. My grandmother is the surly-looking little girl standing at her side. So she was left with these 3 kids. And it took them 12 years to be reunited. And that's how long it took him to raise the money needed to bring them all over. And that kind of lengthy separation was not uncommon in the day. Women like my great-grandmother were known as white widows. White widows, they didn't need to wear black, as was the custom in Italy if their menfolk died. White because their menfolk were still alive, but they were socially dead to them. They were so far away, so they were known as white widows. And I became really fascinated with how you maintain a family with that kind of distance and absence and separation. And despite that long separation, this family stayed together. So in my 30 years of research, I've come to understand that distance and absence are managed by the practices and processes of reciprocal care exchange, which are constitutive of kinship and family life. And I'm going to unpack that thesis for you in the rest of the lecture. So I've come to define transnational families by the care practices that connect them. As it turned out, distance and absence were not over for my great-grandmother, even after coming to Australia, because 2 short years after they were reunited, the war broke out and Italy was on the wrong side. So my great-grandfather was interned for the duration of the war, for the 5 years, as an enemy alien, and he was moved to South Australia, another state, so they couldn't even visit. This is despite great-grandfather being a naturalised British subject and his brother fighting in the Australian Army, but he was seen as a 5th column threat, partly because he was very fluent in both languages and seen as a big man in the community. That's another paper. My great-grandmother was left to run a relatively isolated potato and cattle farm pretty much on her own with 3 teenage kids. And the story goes that she loved to sing, and singing was the main form of entertainment on the mountain where she lived. This is pre-television, remember? And the story goes that from the day her husband was interned, she never sang again. So in my great-grandmother's story, we see the elements of what we call the historical or traditional migration model. In the traditional migration model, migration was conceived as a one-way process that ended in settlement in the host country. And you can see why. It took so long to get them out. There were usually 3 stages: the departure of the lone male, the establishment of a job and accommodation, and then calling over the family. And this traditional straight line model of migration was more or less relevant in Australia until the year 2000, and it directly informed the social policy landscape. So the kind of way that you define the migration process will directly impact the way you conceptualize social policy, in particular around identity and belonging. So the Australian migration case has, until the year 2000, been characterised as a migration of settlement. The Australian government wanted some migrants to settle and become citizens, and in that rendering, ties to homeland were seen as damaging to that process, and assimilation was the social policy. So the idea was that you followed this straight line, you shed your homeland culture, you stopped speaking your homeland language because that would interfere with the process of assimilating and becoming Australians. And that's a very dominant, powerful theory that's still very relevant in the literature today. So this slide is a bit scary, it's very busy. I'm going to attempt a thumbnail sketch of Australian migration history because I want to emphasise a couple of these details. Unlike any other country in the world, Australia can carefully control who enters the country through social and migration policy because it's an island continent and it's very difficult to get to. And this has resulted over the years in a hierarchy of preference that is evident in the waves of migration shown on this slide. So I want you to focus on the middle column, the different waves of migration groups over the years. The list of migration groups or migrant groups reveals the clearly demarcated waves of migration from different sending areas, which up until the 1970s was governed by the Immigration Restriction Act. The Immigration Restriction Act was colloquially known as the White Australia Policy. Many of you have probably heard of it. And this act came into being at a very important moment in settler Australia history with the Federation of States in 1901. So on the eve of the Federation of the Australian States in 1901, we set up the White Australia Policy. And it was not disbanded until 1973. So you can see the earliest waves reflected this preference for a white Australia. So British, Irish and Northern Europeans were facilitated to migrate because they were thought to be more easily assimilated into becoming Australians. It wasn't until the 1950s and the post-war that we saw the massive influx for the first time in Australian history of Southern Europeans going lower down the colour bar as it was then understood. At the time, Southern Europeans from Greece, Italy, the former Yugoslavia were considered non-white. And the then Immigration Minister, Arthur Caldwell, had a hard time trying to convince the Australian people to accept this new wave, and he used a very costly media campaign, populate or perish. If we don't populate, we will perish, primarily to the narrative of the Asian hordes at Australia's north, who weren't white. So this strong policy of assimilation was going to be maintained, which was to placate the continent, reassure them that migrants would assimilate. They would become new Australians. They would shed their homeland cultures and languages. And my grandmother, who was that young girl who arrived in Fremantle at the age of 14 and lived into her 80s, she always referred to herself as a new Australian. It was a very strong and formative policy around identity and belonging. So with the dismantling of White Australia policy in the 1970s, we saw the first significant Asian immigration from those hordes to the north that had previously been the major identity-forming device for the young nation. This began with refugees from Vietnam, and it also coincided with a softening of assimilation policy into integration. And this was largely because the second generation from the post-war period were growing up, people like me. I'm a second-generation Italian migrant. My father migrated in that 50s period. And it wasn't working. We weren't shedding our homeland cultures. We were retaining our cultures. And this shifted our understanding of migration and our understanding of social policy. Just to mention that Aboriginal people were not added to the Australian census until 1967. They also fell victim to this notion of white Australia. 1967, and the recent referendum for the yes vote had the very disturbing outcome of not being passed. So we have a long way to go with Indigenous Australian voice to Parliament. It was not until the 1980s and the progressive politics of multiculturalism, which really were progressive, we saw plural service provision for the first time, that we saw an opening up of immigration to more diverse sending areas. Throughout this whole period, migration, as I said, was characterised as settlement migration. We welcomed certain migrants, and in doing that, we also welcomed their extended family members, their parents, their ageing parents, something that's not happening any longer. Because a migration of settlement, within that there's an understanding if that you want people to settle, you also need to respect their care obligations to their extended kin. So we welcomed family reunion. And it wasn't until the year 2000 that migration policy shifted from family reunion to a focus on skilled and temporary migration, with a significant reduction in family reunion. This slide shows you the outcome of that very clear hierarchy of preference in the ageing of the Australian migration population. So the light blue shaded area are Southern European born, you can see they're getting older, and the green shaded area are Asian born, so they're fast following. We have a very ageing population in Australia. 1 in 3 people over 65 were born in a country that doesn't speak English, so a very diverse ageing population. And people over 85, the number of people over 85 will triple in the next decade, and the number of people over 65 will double. So we are grappling with ageing and diversity, which explains my dementia and migration project. This slide shows you that today we have 72% skilled migration. It's very difficult to get into Australia these days, and only 28% family reunion. And that used to be totally inverted before the year 2000, with the majority of arrivals being from family reunion. And you can see that South Africa is the 5th most common immigrant sending area today. Okay, back to the story of transnational families. By the 1990s, we saw increased connectivity through affordable travel and communication technologies, the polymedia environment that I mentioned before. And this completely unsettled the traditional one-way migration framework. It was no longer adequate to explain what was happening. At this time, in the literature, in migration studies, we started to talk about the mobility turn, or the transnational turn, which I argue also needs to be understood as a technological turn. So that in contrast to the migration model, the traditional straight line migration model, the transnational lens conceptualizes migration as a set of practices and processes of movement and relationship between members of networks, families, communities across distance. And these practices and processes create continuous social fields that contain both home and host places. So this is very different to the straight line thesis. This is a recognition that families, migrant families, actually inhabit continuous social fields despite the fact that they're separated by distance. So when you're on the phone to a loved one far away, they are here with you and you are there with them. So we put meat on the bones of transnational social fields, this nebulous concept, by talking about the practices, the performances of staying in touch across distance. And this 1992 definition from Bash and colleagues is the most commonly cited transnational migration definition. A social process in which migrants establish social fields that cross geographic, cultural and political borders. So in contrast to the assimilationist frame of the traditional migration model, which assumed people would shed their homeland cultures, the transnational frame completely debunks that straight-line thesis and facilitates the possibility of mixed and hyphenated identities. Because if you're here and there in the same, sharing the same transnational social field, you can have mixed and hybrid identities. So it really revolutionized the way we think about identity politics as well. Okay. So in my work on transnational families, I operationalized the notion of transnational social fields by examining practices and processes of care exchange. I defined transnational families by the care practices that connect them. And I want to show you some examples of what I mean by this by drawing on some ethnographic cases. There are two key ways that transnational social fields are enlivened, that is through visits and through technology, information and communication technologies. And I want to begin by sharing with you my favourite quote from over 200 migration histories that we collected in our research. This is of a grandmother in Ireland who commented, "When my uncle migrated to Australia in the 1900s, we held a kind of wake, a funeral ritual, in the local pub because we honestly did not know if we would ever see him again." In her words, it was a kind of social death that her uncle was leaving them for. She went on to say that in contrast, when her nephew left for Australia a few years ago on a working holiday visa, his departure inspired the family to buy a new computer. So from a type of social death and the wake in the pub to the purchase of a new computer. And this quote captures the radical transformation in our experience of migration today, in the words of a granny from Ireland. In terms of visits, I want to use this data, which is 1 million years old from my PhD, showing the visit histories of 9 couples. And you can see that in the 50s and 60s, they were visiting from Australia to Italy. Very rarely, you had to have a really good reason to visit because it was so expensive, it took so long on the boat going back. So the reasons were to bury parents, to go home for funerals, or to find a bride. It was very difficult to get married in Australia at the time. There was a lot of prejudice against Southern Europeans, and so you went home to marry your bride. But by the 70s, 80s and 90s, and continuing into the present day, except for the COVID years, you see that some people are visiting every year. Now, of course, we can say that the capacity to be mobile and the capacity to be connected online are two of the most clear ways that inequality divides the globe today. So there are many families that experience 12 years of separation today in the way that my great-grandparents did all 100 years ago. I'm thinking of the enormous numbers of domestic care migrant workers who leave their homelands, for example, the Philippines, but this is also relevant to the African context, leaving children behind or leaving elderly parents behind and being connected. Whether they have capacity to visit is often determined by social policy, and whether they can afford the technologies that support being in touch. So we'll come back to that question in question time because it also is relevant to the book that we've just launched. So a quick note on methodology. Because I'm an anthropologist and I do migration studies, I can't really inhabit a village because my people are moving all the time. So we talk about ethnographic returning. And I certainly agree with you. If you want someone to form a connection to a place, you get them to visit and then they just keep coming back. And that returning is a real theme in migration studies. It's a way to develop consociate connections and identities. Yeah. So these are just some research projects. I've been funded by the Australian Research Council. I work closely with Raylene Wilding at La Trobe. I'm sorry, the names of the places have migrated a bit on that slide. But they're the main countries we've looked at because they represent different kinds of migration. Labour migration from Italy and Ireland, skilled migration from the Netherlands, refugees in transit in Iran. Singapore's very close to Australia on the same time zone, and New Zealand has special visa policies that facilitate mobility. Okay, just 2 more theory slides before we get to the fun stuff and the case studies. So the way we conceptualize transnational family life is to say that they are connected and defined by and constituted by the performance of care across distance, which is facilitated by communication technologies and visits. And we talk about different types of care: emotional and moral support, practical, financial, which you can do across distance, which also happens in proximate or families that share place. And accommodation and personal or hands-on care can also happen, but usually by proxy. So we talk about modes of care, using different forms of technology. We talk about different types of visits, routine, quotidian, ritual, crisis. And through all of this, we also talk about different types of co-presence. You can have virtual co-presence, imagined, ambient, and proxy. And my examples will highlight what I mean by each of these. What is central, I think, to understanding transnational families is, for us, this notion of kinning. How do you do family across distance? And we draw on this anthropological concept of kinning to help us explain it. In the 1980s, the notion of kinship, a central anthropological concept, was unbiologicized by the Schneiders, who argued that ideas about the family are formed not on the basis of blood, what is given, but rather on the basis of what is done, performed, and exchanged. And anthropologists of adoption in particular picked up this idea because obviously when you adopt a child into a family, they're not a child of blood, but they become kin through the type of care work that is enacted around them. So Howell, who coined this notion of kinning in adoption studies, argues that a newborn child is brought into a significant and permanent relationship with a group of people expressed in a kin idiom, something that is necessarily achieved in and through relationships with others. And the main argument here is that kinship ties do not exist a priori, but are negotiated on a daily basis through diverse activities like caregiving. And Marshall Sahlins, I think, he's gone on to extend this idea about kinship when he argues, quite controversially, that kinship is entirely a cultural construction, even when it's biological. So he says that even biological kin are created, are formed into kin through acts of care, because we can have biological kin who we reject from our kinship circles, right? So for Sahlins, kinship is a form of mutuality of being, and I really like this idea of mutuality of being. Kinfolk are persons who participate intrinsically in each other's existence. They are members of one another. Mutuality of being. And I like this idea because you don't have to like each other to share a mutuality of being. It can really define family relationships in all their complexity. So the question for transnational family studies then becomes, can you sustain mutuality of being across distance? Can you sustain mutuality of being in families separated by distance and time? So I'm going to begin with a pre-war example in a pre-polymedia environment. And I'm going to just use one example because I'm very conscious of time. So the second example. Dino coped with loneliness during his 8-year separation as a timber worker in Western Australia by writing home to his wife regularly. And in his letters, he would evoke his wife's image and that of his small child. In one letter, he writes, "I think of him, my child Silvio, and I see him in every moment of the day, just as if I were with you, trying to forget how far away I am. And at the end of the day and after my hard work, I can't have before me everything that made me happy, listening to him, seeing him, playing with him. And instead, for now, I have to content myself with thinking of him and imagine he's in front of me, happy and mischievous, just how he was, and I escape into my thoughts and am happy." So this, for us, is an example of imagined co-presence, and I think you can get a sense of a mutuality of being that Dino is trying to sustain, despite the fact that he can only do this through letters. There are many, many examples, and I won't go through them all, but there's some wonderful collections of letters that provide more evidence of this idea. Instead, there is this extraordinary example of two young lovers who wrote letters to each other in a one-year period between 1948 and 1949. Antonietta was in Canada and Loris was in Venice, and they sustained their love through this extraordinary set of letters which has been published by Sonia Chanchan. And I just want to ask you the question, how many letters do you think these two lovers wrote in a one-year period? Any suggestions? Quite a few, yeah. How many? Sorry? 200. More? 450. And there's one, yeah. And this is actually not that uncommon. Some dutiful daughters wrote home weekly, dutiful mothers responded weekly. This is actually not that uncommon. And care work, whether it's distant, across distance or proximate, takes time and effort, and that's definitely something that's proven in the data. So let's go to the post-war and Federica. Federica and her family have generally maintained close and regular contact, although there have been what Federica describes as dark periods when she did not feel as emotionally supported as she wished. I felt that, well, I might as well be dead for them because, I'm so far away. So that sense of social death comes through even in the post-war period. The sense of isolation was exacerbated by contact being primarily by letter and infrequent phone calls. So we see phone calls appearing in this period, which gave Federica an unsatisfying level of detail about daily events. She was yearning for a mutuality of being that wasn't there. I want to know exactly what's happening, and during the visit home, I used to find out that this happened and that happened, and I was reproaching my dad for not telling me, also the negative things, like somebody died. So a really common practice was hiding the truth from distant families so as not to upset them, because there was nothing they could do. But that actually undermined their sense of connection and mutuality of being. So she's telling her dad off, you've got to keep me informed. These dark periods diminished as phone calls became more affordable. It revolutionised the capacity to be connected. At first, it was really expensive, so you couldn't say much. People talk about worrying about the cost of the call rather than what they're saying. But then when the price reduced, that was very, very important because, you can pick up the phone more or less any time, check how things are going when something worries you. I just want to mention that at the time, in this post-war period, a big salary was about $13 a week, and it was $1 a minute to pay for the phone call. Now, this has some resonance with the experience of poorer families in the case studies that we present in the African case, because poorer families can't afford the smartphones where the data is, where the connectivity is free, and they're paying the expensive phone calls. So now to a contemporary case of Andrea, a working holiday maker. His case represents a common pattern of transnational care today. Andrea is studying in Australia and his parents are young old, quite independent. His mother, Anna, sends him texts every day, even too often, he bemoans. she's always sending me these stickers on Viber. They're kind of silly, but, for her, they're a way to tell me that she's thinking of me and that she's caring about me. We call that ambient co-presence. When the ping goes off, when you hear the sticker arrive, you know your mum's thinking about you. It's an ambient co-presence you carry around with you. The digital device comes to represent the co-presence. Andrea feels he has to reciprocate by sending stickers back to his mum, but he's trained her to accept that 1 or 2 a day is enough. So Andrea says that he's had to become religious about the weekend Skype call. You have to have a really good reason to skip the call, like you are dead. So there's no reason. There's no good reason. And here he's bemoaning the opposite of social death, right? His parents harass him, actually. During the call, his mother and father both participate, but it's usually his mother who stays on the call the longest. Dad will come, he'll take a good look at me, see if I look okay and say hi. Mum will ask me lots of questions. She'll go into detail. What am I eating? How am I sleeping? What am I feeling? She's really worried about me, tries to look after me. Of course, I like to see them too, but really once a week is even too much. It's an obligation. Okay, so some of this will resonate with many of you. You get an email, you've got an email, you should respond. And that's, I think, what we're seeing here with the polymedia environment. So just a summary to compare mutuality of being capacities in pre-polymedia and contemporary times. In the pre-polymedia examples, and they are concurrent with contemporary times for some families, we have irregular letters and telegrams, costly phone calls, very rare visits. Co-presence was asynchronous, not shared in real time, so one letter arrives and then you wait and you send back the other letter. Intermittent, often formulaic, so people assumed roles and relied on roles to remain connected, the good mother, the good father, the good daughter. So narratives were broken, the way we co-narrate our lives were often broken and insufficient. There was that feeling that you lacked a mutuality of being that people yearned for. In contrast, in contemporary polymedia environments, for those who have access, you can have daily multiple SMS scaffolded with regular emails, phone calls, affordable visits. You have synchronous, real-time, shared time, continuous forms of co-presence, including ambient, multi-sensory, the introduction of the video call, the video over internet protocol was a revolution as well in capacities to be connected. Continuous narratives are possible that approximate physical presence and sometimes improve on it. Very contentious argument. So to summarise some of our other findings, access, of course, is uneven and there are policy implications around access and we have a generational divide. So what we see in our data is new technologies surprisingly expanding support networks where in the past they were reduced. So in the past I spoke about one mum sending letters to daughter and daughter returning letters and everyone else just signing their name at the bottom. They were sharing information that way. Today, you've got these expanded networks where young people and men participate because they know how to use the technology. So the classic example is grandson sets up the technology for grandma in one country and son sets up the technology for mum in another country, and those cousins communicate to set up the call. And before you know it, they have a relationship developed entirely online, and they facilitate the access of the generational divide for their elders. So polymedia environments offer the potential for the first time in history for some of us to control when and how we stay in touch across distance. And this choice introduces a moral dimension and set of obligations. So the example I like to use from my own life history is it okay to text mum happy birthday, or should I phone her, or should I visit? And there's one right answer. If your mum's Italian, yeah. So all communication forms and formats are sources of contestation as well as harmonious relations. So I'm really big on the idea that technology in and of itself is not good or bad. It's how we use it. And there's a vast literature on the dangers of technology, which is very valid. But this work is about how technology is harnessed to facilitate capacities to care and share mutuality of being. And the reason I spent so much time at the start talking about how the way we conceptualize migration processes to show how it impacts on policy is because in ageing in place policy, for example, this is the dominant policy globally to support older people to live for as long as possible, as independently as possible in their own homes. And that's a really good aim, because most people want to do that. They want to live in their own homes. And you'll see all the dimensions, the policy framings to support ageing in place. But what's missing is distant care. And distant care is critical for migrants. As migrants age, they lose their facility in the host language, they revert to first language, especially if there's some cognitive decline. It may be that the networks that are most able to support them are back in the homeland. And we have many, many examples of older people relying on those regular phone calls home for that emotional well-being, and even to organise care locally. So by proxy, they'll ring home and then someone in the network back home will facilitate the care service for them locally. So we need to put the distant carers in, otherwise we're really missing an important part of the story. I have one more case to share. I think I've still got a few minutes. This is a transnational ageing case. So I wanted to not only explore over time, pre-war, post-war, and the contemporary day, I also wanted to share over ageing, as we get older and what happens to our transnational family experiences. So this is the story of Rina, who lives in Italy and who, together with her husband, had enjoyed visiting their daughter Daniela in Perth regularly. Perth is a great place to study transnational families because it's the most isolated capital city in the world. And our transnational families are primarily adult migrant children caring for ageing parents from a distance, because now it's really difficult to get parents to migrate. There's very few ways you can do that. Now, when Rina's husband died unexpectedly, her social support network diminished rapidly because he was the social one who maintained all the social ties. Rina became depressed, and her daughter in Perth decided to arrange for her to take an extended 3-month visit to Perth. 3 months was the limit of the visit visa at the time. That's all you could get. It's changed since then because of lobbying, partly through transnational family research. The visit went well, and Rina's mental health improved. However, towards the end of her visit, Rina fell and broke her hip and was hospitalised. The hospitalisation was facilitated by reciprocal healthcare benefits between Italy and Australia, really important transnational policy that all countries should investigate, which was a great asset. But in hospital, Rina contracted hospital-acquired pneumonia and became gravely ill. She began to die. Unfortunately, when her visa, 3 months, expired, despite applications to the minister, the daughter had to take time off work to accompany Rina back to Italy in a critical ill state. The airline was absolutely fine with that. Apparently it's not uncommon. A note on the policy context. Of course, the daughter tried to get parent migration visa for Rina. There are 2 pathways. The contributory stream, which costs over 50,000 Australian dollars, which she couldn't afford and most people can't, or the non-contributory stream, which was more affordable at about $10,000, but it had a 30-year processing period. So most people in the line aren't going to live that long, right? So that's called administrative slowdown. And all this is about an ageist view of the capacities of older people and what they bring. So parents are seen as a cost rather than what they're actually doing, which in Australia is contributing significant unpaid care. Because we can't afford care labour in the way this country can. We use our grannies, actually, unpaid, and we fly them over. So there's a whole literature on flying grannies as well. So back in Italy, Daniela, the daughter, was unable to secure a place for her mother in the local nursing home because the director argued that family care was an essential component of residential care, and with the daughter living in Perth, this would not be adequate. I remember thinking how mean that director was. But actually, after doing ethnography in residential care in Australia, I understand where she's coming from. Many people don't get any visits at all, and it's soul-destroying. There's no mutuality of being. There's no personhood or sociality, and that's what the director was concerned about. Daniela tried to make a case about transnational care. You know, she said, look, I can Skype mum. If you get the nurses to facilitate that, I can do that every day. It wasn't in the policy framing. And even still today, COVID has helped a bit because we all understood the role of technology during COVID lockdowns. But still, residential care are often black spots where there's no internet, staff are not trained. We have done some interventions where we've put phone calls and video calls into the care plans, and then they happen. It's not rocket science, it's not expensive, it can really turn a person's experience around. Anyway, in this case, that couldn't happen. So instead, Daniela hired 2 migrant care workers, which she could afford in the Italian context, and she had to go back to Australia to her husband and children and job, and for 2 years, because her mother revived, being back at home, she continued to do this transnational care by proxy with facilitated digital kinning of her mother, who couldn't use any of the technology. She hired and fired care workers until she found the right mix. She favoured Romanians because they benefited from the Schengen Agreement and could roster themselves as care workers, and many of these people she never met in person. And that's where we got the idea for digital kinning from. We saw evidence again and again in our cases of people kinning supports into their networks entirely virtually in really profound ways. Just another lovely example of, unlike Rina, who was a transnational ageing case, this case is of a woman who migrated in her youth but grew old in Australia. And then she went into residential care, and she said her world was reduced to 4 walls. And she's holding up her, what she called mobile phone. It's actually a landline, but you can take it out of the, container. She carries it in her apron pocket. And she would be ringing, I don't know how well you can see this, other places in Perth, obviously, but outer London, Bologna in Italy, Margaret River, which is down south of WA, and Argentina. So all her family who could speak her dialect. And she'd get those people to speak to the nurses to help facilitate her care locally, paying exorbitant amount for the phone calls, I have to say. So I just want to end with this slide, and I can leave it up for question time, which is sort of a sketch of our conceptual framework where digital kinning and transnational care requires capacity, resources and opportunity. It's influenced by obligation. These are the cultural values and expectations that determine our worlds, as well as the negotiated family commitments in the specific families that are trying to work this out. And I think that framing attempts to deal with the huge differences and inequalities in capacities, obligations, and negotiated family commitments. And of course, capacities are both individual as well as community and state and transnational based as well. So thanks very much, everyone, for your attention.
Thank you, Loretta. I don't think I need the microphone. My family tells me I'm very loud. I'm also Italian.
It's genetic.
Okay. You sound even louder then. Okay. So thank you, Loretta. I've heard the lecture already a couple of times because I'm part of the sort of rock and roll tour of the country. And what you've heard tonight, it's taken me 15 years to read up and process this information, and you got it so well organized and summarized tonight. So thank you very much, Loretta. So our relationship, as Loretta said, also started by email. So we're also a good example of how people connect across the oceans through technology. And Loretta was generous and kind enough to actually respond to my email. So, it's thanks to that response that actually we are here. So, you've heard this very interesting lecture, and Loretta and Leslie and I have had many discussions about some of these concepts and these ideas when we were busy with our research project and then writing the book. But we are also keen, I'm not going to start giving my usual one, but what about physical touch? We are Italian, we like to hug people, and you can't hug a computer. So we always have the debate, so maybe let me put it out there. But the more I listen to Loretta, the more I'm moving to the other side, I think. So maybe questions, or comments, anything from the audience? And maybe we take a couple. Otherwise, I'm going to ask questions myself, and you're bored with my questions. Yes.
Thank you. Oh, I don't know if I want to speak through the mic. That was so interesting to me because I have a long story, which I'm not going to tell here, but when I was in matric in Paarl in South Africa, we had an exchange student who lived with another family who used as an unpaid au pair, and she came to our house, and her mother and father were so grateful that she asked me along with her, and we still correspond after 50 years.
Wow.
I only saw her in person 3 times.
Wow.
But now she had a stroke, and because we can communicate video calls, but she cannot actually express herself anymore, which is such a sad... but the digital communication really helped for a long time.
Thank you. I mean, capacity as we age, of course, hearing, sight, all these things. And actually, I'm equally interested in the visit as in technology and communication, and one of the enduring cases from my ethnography and residential care, including during COVID, was the value of the visit in person. So to respond also to the proximate, we were visiting Natale regularly, and then there was a lockdown, and when we went back to see him in Perth, it was really minimal lockdown. We went back about a month later, and he was such a different being. He was so closed down, and his sister provoked him. She said, "Natale, are you alive?" And he slowly came back to life, literally. And it was in that moment that I understood that the visit is really about sociality. It's really about creating that capacity for mutuality of being in reviving Natale. And if you don't have a visit, and visits can be virtual as well, certainly, but in cases where you no longer have those capacities, the proximate is critical.
Yeah, and I think with COVID, we all had a bit of this experience. Some of us have real experiences of our family members being far away, but COVID, in a way, made transnational migrants out of all of us, because that became the only way in which we could communicate using the technology, which I think, in a way, was interesting, because when we were doing our research and writing up this research was during COVID. So, we kind of really developed more empathy, I suppose, for our own participants.
Yeah.
Leslie, I can see you want to ask a question.
Thank you so much. Yeah, very interesting. I just wanted to, so I can see some sort of similarities between maybe what's happening in Australia and maybe within also the South African context, some similarities. But I just wanted to find out from your side, when you spoke a little bit about the Aboriginal people, and then also how they, to what extent they feel part or not part of the Australian community.
Yeah.
And then maybe if you can say a bit about that. Then the other part I think I wanted to find out was, so migrants, I think the issue about migrants, the push and pull factors. So in economies like ours, these are also linked to the economy of the country, and so they sort of breed other things like maybe xenophobia or other types of phobias. And I think when you were mentioning, you were also talking about Indian immigrants or Asian immigrants, and I don't know how I think they fit into the picture in terms of I know they add a lot of value because, you know, people, they come to do something, they don't come to do nothing. But so how do you sort of, what question would I pose there? How do they actually fit in? I mean, what's the sense around what's going on in terms of policy going forward? And the issue of people aging, of course, because for that you also need to get labor, isn't it, additional labor? I know like German, for example, now they go to the Philippines to get nurses to look after their elderly. And then even there they complain about, well, some people complain, but I think now it's a bit better than it was before around complaining about foreign people coming into the country. So yeah, I just wanted to know how it affects policy and maybe...
Yeah, thank you for the question, really complex. I'll do my best to respond. I'll start with the second question first. So I think the way we best manage it is through strong leadership and strong social policy. So if you look at the Australian case, in the 1980s we had a very progressive politics of multiculturalism. This recognised that people couldn't shed their homeland cultures and assimilate. It wasn't happening, and there was no need for it to. We had a relatively stable political climate and a good economy, so that also impacts. But with multicultural policy, we had the birth of plural service delivery. So we saw the beginning of ethno-specific services. So you could go to a Greek-speaking doctor, you could go to a Vietnamese nursery. We really celebrated our capacity to deliver services to support difference. And the philosophical tenet, if you like, of multiculturalism is that to treat people equally, you need to recognise their difference, okay? So there's politics around this, of course. Some people say multiculturalism is inherently racist because we're acknowledging difference, but I think in the way it played out in the Australian context, it was very successful. So multicultural policies celebrated mixed identities, and we learnt this from sociolinguistics. So we used to think that if you kept your homeland language, it would interfere with your capacity to learn the host language. But sociolinguists proved to us, with very careful data, that if you have strong first language, you have better outcomes in your second language. So this also began to support the notion of mixed identity. I know you had Homi Bhabha here recently. He's the third space guy, right? So third space became something that multiculturalism celebrated. And we did, many studies that showed that those migrant groups that did best were the ones that had the cultural brokers, who were usually the second generation, or the well-educated people who could facilitate access for the others. So multiculturalism, and we got really good at it because we would also be very careful that it wasn't just the older men who had the voice of the community. We would look at intersections, intersection theory was all part of this time, and feminist perspectives on intersections. This unfortunately has decayed a bit since 9/11 in particular, and the politics of Fortress Europe and xenophobia and, the economic global economic crisis and more difficulty and complex economic environments. So we've seen a change to what we call mainstreaming. Mainstreaming is the idea that you have one service that fits everyone. Many people argue that it's a return to assimilation and it serves the dominant best. So there's argument about that. But there's an excellent book which sounds very boring called The Public Life of Australian Multiculturalism, but I found it a real page-turner, where Anthony Moran argues that multiculturalism was so successful for the Australian psyche that we still have very strong everyday multiculturalism in our schools, in our homes, even in our services. So that even though the government has retreated from using that terminology and funding those kinds of plural service policies, it's still happening at the community roots level, and you do see that. So social policy is really important. What pains me today with our ageing society is that, you know, we don't have adequate language supports for dementia. We don't allow parents to come over and live with their migrant children, because we have all these temporary migration policies, which, you know, we think that's picking winners, but actually they're not going to stay because they've got obligations. You know, I like the development approach to migration studies, where you consider the impact on the sending area. So you say, if we're going to benefit from the social reproduction costs that created the labourer and take the labourer, let's also honour the care obligations to the extended family. But, you know, I do try and tell my government this. Now, your question about Australian Aboriginal people, it's not my area of expertise, but so what I can say is that for many years, Indigenous politics was kept separate to migration politics for good reason. But more recently, it's come together because we see the same issues in service provision. And it, you know, was a terrible state of affairs that the recent referendum for the yes vote, a very simple, basic vote for a voice to Parliament for Indigenous people, was unsuccessful, mainly because of, you know, scaremongering tactics by the far-right parties and, you know, the echo chambers that occur with the algorithms that guide you to certain information and misinformation, because it was a very narrow loss. But yeah, that tells you a lot about our country's treatment of Indigenous people.
Thanks, Loretta. Can you just tell us what your understanding of digital justice is, and what that would look like in Australia and what that would look like in Africa?
Yeah. Digital justice has been a key theme that came out of the Transnational Families in Africa book, and I think it's what this book contributes to the literature. It's such a big issue for the African case. In the Australian case, it's more about the digital justice of the marginalised, like the elderly. Why is it that older people in residential care don't have access to the internet? Why aren't we training our care staff so that they can facilitate digital access? So we talk about facilitated digital access. So a lot of digital justice for me in Australia is about facilitated digital access. The African case, I think, is more for us to work out together, and I really, in the public lectures I've given, I've been approached, or we've been approached by a number of, you know, potential PhD candidates who'd like to explore a translocal or a transnational family PhD study with us, because this is relatively underdeveloped in the African context. So there's a huge literature in Europe because of the care chains. You might have heard of the care chains. The care chain is the idea that you have a global south woman leaves behind her care obligations to care for the care obligations of a global north woman, so that the global north woman can remain in the workforce. And then money flows back and love flows this way. Love for gold. This is Ali Hochschild's work, and Perennies. This work actually has a history in Africa with the maids and madams literatures that predated the care chains, actually. But the transnational family kind of is part of care chains literature, but different countries produce different kinds of transnational families with different constellations of factors. And for me, digital justice, it's about access to reliable internet. You know, the United Nations, not that long ago, said that access to the internet is a human right. They were talking about information, because if you don't have access to truth information, you know, you really struggle. But I think access to the internet is equally relevant to connectivity and care. I don't have my meme of Maslow's hierarchy of need where the Wi-Fi is at the bottom. That's not a very good answer, Leslie, because I think we have to work that answer out together. It's a cop-out.
Maybe,
do you want to comment?
Yeah, you want to comment? No, I mean, in the work that we did, Loretta is very kind to almost do a little bit of marketing for a book as we go along. We interviewed African migrants who came from different African countries working in South Africa, and also people moving from rural to urban areas, and how they use communication technology to maintain family relationship. So our kind of idea around digital justice is more how people need to have access, in order to maintain family relationship and in order to be able to care for each other. And of course, what we found that, WhatsApp is a great tool, but you need a smartphone, and a smartphone is very expensive, and many people cannot afford a smartphone. And then they have to make the expensive phone calls rather than using WhatsApp calls. They need data, and data is expensive. So many of our participants would say, yes, maybe I have a phone, but if I have to choose between buying food and buying data, I buy food. So people have to prioritize certain needs that maybe in other examples in the world, like the idea of digital justice is about having access to knowledge and information. While here, I think it's also the ability to remain connected with family members who are distant, because you've had to move and leave your family behind, often in order to take care of them, because you do not have access to jobs or employment. So already people have made the sacrifice of moving away from their families, but they're unable to keep those kind of connections because of the affordability, and the kind of, ability to have a proper network connection. So, I mean, we heard really some really heartbreaking stories around this.
You're reminding me of the Chinese case where it's primarily urbanization, but also some transnational migration, but it's villages with grannies left behind, and the young adults are moved to the city, and they don't have capacities to use digital technologies. So this is a very weird translation, but something called love libraries grew up, which is libraries that provide people access to digital devices and the internet and facilitate the calls. So, which it's a really great idea, isn't it? Because libraries are usually quite well resourced and can often exist in many places. So they were using love libraries. I think they should get a different English word myself. But anyway, because it's about sharing.
And Notable, who's the timekeeper, but like in our research, we interviewed DRC refugees who kind of work in a barber shop in Hillbrow. It's a wonderful story, but people share a cell phone. So that becomes, only one or two people have access to a cell phone, and they share the cell phone, so they create also community around this in order to be able to communicate. But Anotabo, who's the timekeeper, because when we start talking about this, we get very excited. So let me stop there. I'm also kind of taking over the question and answer, and from my side, thank you very much, Loretta, and thank you for engaging with the audience. And now I'm going to give Professor Sudiale the chance to say the final words. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Loretta and Marie, for this wonderful discussion. Colleagues, the Distinguished Visiting Scholar program at ASSAf was designed so that we had opportunities of advancing scholarship and exchange of minds. And I can tell you, while I've been sitting here listening to the talk, I know every single one of you must have already premised a story of your own around the topic. And I don't know if it was ESP or what, but both my brothers, one in the US and one in Durban, contacted me while I was listening to this. Maybe we bond on an ESP level as well. And we were so fortunate and grateful to Leslie and Marie for giving us the opportunity of hosting you, Loretta. And you unstintingly gave us of your time to travel the country. And that's part and parcel of the program, that we invite the scholar to reach out, not just to the big 4 or 5 universities, but also to assist in the outreach of taking science to universities outside of the big cities. And you did that with great aplomb, going to Limpopo, University of Limpopo, the Orange Free State, and also to Rhodes University in Grahamstown, where I was fortunate to have had my first exchange with Loretta. So I had 2 compliments given to me, and I'm going to use the podium to share it. I'm a hardcore population evolutionary geneticist, but Sibu said that I was a social scientist. So I must be doing my molecular anthropology very, very well.
I meant to add to that sentence about the genomic sequencing.
And earlier I met with Professor Jonathan Jansen, and he recently invited us to write a chapter in a new book that he was doing. And he was discussing with my friend Judith and me my paper, and he said, you know what? You surely masquerade as a social scientist very, very well. So yes. But that is what life is about, right? It's about the science and the communication of the science and reaching out in an interpersonal way. And Loretta, you have done that so amazingly well. I have enjoyed my short interaction with you. And you know, it's just been a great, great opportunity for the Academy and Scholarship of Academics in South Africa to have you as our guest for this, 23-24 financial year. We do alternate at ASSAf. 1 year we put out a call for social science and humanities, and another year we do this for health sciences, etc. And before I forget my manners, I want to acknowledge one of our council members, Professor Majosi, who's in the audience. Thank you very much for joining us. It's lovely to have you here as well. And to our hosts, the STIAS family and Stellenbosch, for hosting us, and it is a great place to end the kind of journey. I know you have one more function tomorrow at UCT, but at least in terms of the discussion of the topic of transnational family care, you've given us so much to think about. And for me, this happens on a day-to-day basis, but I don't have the acumen to put it together in the way you have given interpretation to the subject. So thank you very much for all of that. And thank you to the audience for joining us in person, and to all those people who have joined us online. It's been a real, real pleasure to have you. But my last duty is to formally acknowledge my colleagues at ASSAf, particularly Toboko, who has another role for me to perform. So Toboko, come up and join me. So, Professor Loretta Baldassar, I have the great privilege and honor to present to you a certificate with the title of the Distinguished Professor Certificate Award.
Thank you, that's beautiful. It's such an honor, thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Sorry? Yes. And something to add to your 20-kilogram.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
Yes. Oh, I'm emotional.
She's from down under. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Thank you. Anyone? And there's something in here for you.
Oh, thank you. And I've had such fun. I've just been touring around.
And one for our other person who's driven all over the country. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, what's that? Okay. Yeah, let's take another photo. Oh, wow,
Look at me. Let me give you mine.
That's amazing.
As you can see, your color.
I'll send you this one. If you can just join.
With all of you.
Do you want your legs as well?
No.
I'm just checking.
Well, thanks again, colleagues, and I'm sure there's refreshments outside, so please join us and you can get a chance to engage with Loretta as well. Thank you so much. Bye for now.